So, lesson 5.2 is all about ecosystems, which we've talked about, and we know that now we've moved up from populations, which is one species, to community, which is all the living things, and now ecosystems contain all the living and non-living things. The level below, again, ecological communities only include living organisms. An ecosystem, now we're looking at everything, so all the water, all the sunlight, all the earth, all of those things that are in the same spot and interact together. So in ecosystems, we have a lot of things flowing. We have energy and matter flowing through the ecosystem. So starting with energy, like we talked about, all the energy comes from the sunlight. And so sunlight provides energy to the producers. And the producers harness the sunlight and turn it into chemical energy. So all these green arrows show the chemical energy flowing. So the producers, they harness the sunlight, turn it into chemical energy, but they lose some of that energy as heat because they still do cellular respiration. They still need the energy, the chemical energy that they capture, so we lose some as heat. Then it moves up the food chain from grasshoppers, or from primary consumers to secondary consumers to tertiary consumers. You can see the arrows getting thinner because only 10% goes up the trophic levels. And at every level, energy is lost as heat. That's through the metabolism of the organism that's using it. So the ultimate fate of all this energy is that it's getting lost as heat. So energy flows in a one direction through an ecosystem, with it eventually all ending as heat. Then we also just see that some of this energy is going down to the decomposers and these are the detritivores, and back and forth to the decomposers. So some rodents eat decomposers, I guess. So again, energy is eventually being lost as heat in this way. It's a one-way system. Vice versa, with matter is, and all atoms, anything that has mass, right? So the producers make the organic compounds from the nutrients that they get from the soil, that the detritus from the decomposers and detritivores break down. So they are getting it from the soil, and then it's moving up the food chain, and then we're dying, and it's being cycled. So matter is conserved within an ecosystem. Matter is not lost. When something dies, it's eventually broken down, and those nutrients are taken up again via the decomposers and detritivores. So energy goes one way, matter is cycled. Okay, so there's living things and non-living things as part of an ecosystem. So for example, the Chesapeake Bay that we keep talking about is an ecosystem. It's an estuary, which means that it's a mix of salt water and fresh water, because that's where a river flows into the ocean. And so the organisms are affected by the non-living things such as the flow of water, the nutrients in the water, and the sediment from the rivers, and all of the chemical and physical conditions. So the different chemistry of the water, the pH, the salts, the chemicals that are there, as well as the physical conditions, the temperature, the movement of it, all of that are affected by the photosynthesis, respiration, and decomposition of its life. So here's how the organisms are affected by the non-living things, and how the non-living things are affected by the organisms. Okay, so in every ecosystem, energy is converted into biomass. And remember that biomass is the mass stored in living things. And so when that process of energy turning into biomass, we call it production. So the conversion of solar energy into chemical bonds and sugars, aka photosynthesis, is called primary production. So plants do primary production. And we have two kinds of it. We have the total amount of energy produced by the autotrophs is the gross primary production. So all of the energy that's made. However, remember that those autotrophs, those plants, need to use energy themselves. They need to do cellular respiration. So they burn some of that energy, back to this graph here. So all of the energy made here would be the gross primary production, but the energy that is passed on, available for other things, would be the net primary production. And so then energy that's used by consumers, so the energy that we get from the things that we eat to generate our own biomass, is called secondary production, because we're not making it from the sun, we're making it from energy that someone else has already made. And the rate at which energy is converted into biomass is termed productivity. So how quickly we're turning energy into mass. We're taking energy, which originally is from the sun, and storing it in chemical bonds, making mass inside of our bodies or any living thing's bodies. So we can compare the rate of primary productivity or overall productivity amongst different ecosystems. So ecosystems such as the freshwater wetlands, the tropical forest, coral reef, and algal beds tend to have the highest net primary productivity, and the deserts, tundra, and open ocean have the lowest. I'm sure that that would make sense to you. These areas have less plants than these areas. So the ones with the most plants are going to be able to do the most primary productivity. So in terrestrial ecosystems, so the ones found on land, we tend to see the most primary productivity. It increases with temperature and precipitation. So the warmer that it is and the more water that we have, the more plants are going to thrive, and then we have higher primary productivity. In aquatic ecosystems, net primary productivity tends to rise with light and availability of nutrients, which makes sense. The autotrophs, the algae in the ocean, they need sunlight. So the closer they are to the top of the ocean, they need sunlight, and they also need nutrients in the water to be able to do photosynthesis. Okay, so nutrients, like I said, are elements and compounds that organisms require for survival. So they're found in nature, and there's several dozen that different organisms need to survive. The ones that we need in large amounts, so for example, nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus, this is what makes up the majority of the molecules in our body, are called macronutrients because we need a lot of them. And then we need other ones in smaller amounts. So for example, zinc, copper, and iron, and these are called micronutrients. So nutrients stimulate production in plants, and so a lack of nutrients can limit production. It would be a limiting factor for the plants. So in marine ecosystems, so in the ocean, nitrogen is the limiting nutrient amongst primary producers, and in freshwater systems, it's phosphorus. So there isn't enough nitrogen to go around in marine ecosystems for all the plants, and there isn't enough, phosphorus to go around in freshwater ecosystems. So this is a lake in Ontario, and you can see that over here, there was a lot of phosphorus in this portion of the lake from the runoff. So as the water is flowing over the land and getting to this body of water via the watershed, there was an excess of phosphorus, and so the algal bloom, so the algae that live there, were able to flourish, and so it turned the water opaque because there was such a big algal bloom. So getting back to dead zones, dead zones are found mostly in coastal areas with the greatest human ecological footprints because all the runoff from our activities are causing the dead zones there. So there's about more than 500 dead zones have been recorded across the world, and this number is definitely increasing. But based on humans realizing that this is happening and us doing something about it, we have been able to decrease them. For example, in New York City, there used to be a bunch around the edge of the ends of the rivers that run through New York City, but we used to. Now that they've improved sewage treatment, those have gone down. So we're just doing our best to, decrease these dead zones. Another important thing about ecosystems is that they do interact with each other. They are not self-contained. So ecosystems that are next to each other interact and share resources extensively. So for example, for when an ecosystem ends and another begins, there's not a barrier where things aren't interacting. Of course, we are still moving over. Energy and matter are still flowing across those two. Areas where ecosystems meet in a transitional zone. So there's not a big wall between the two, but they kind of blend into each other, and these are called ecotones. And so landscape ecologists are looking at the patterns of ecosystems. And so since ecosystems overlap and flow together, ecologists look at them on a bigger scale, and this is called landscape ecology, where we look at multiple ecosystems and how they interact together. And so a landscape is made of patches, which are specific organisms that are spread out. And so patches are usually spread out spatially over a landscape in what's called a mosaic. So here is a landscape, an example of landscape ecology. So we have a bunch of different ecosystems here, and all these red lines are where the ecotones are, where the two are interacting. So if you zoom in on this ecotone, we can see patches. This is what it means by patches. So this lighter green is the lowland broadleaf forest, and this tan is the grassland. And so you can see that as where the ecotone is, we have patches of grassland in with the forest and patches of forest in with the grassland. And so that's what an ecotone is, where we're going to see patches in a mosaic. Sometimes we see what's called a corridor. So there's a lot of this broadleaf forest over here, and it extends across the river over by this freshwater marsh. And so this is called a corridor. It's an area that connects one one section of one ecosystem to another section of another ecosystem to prevent them from becoming patches. They are connected by a corridor. This fragmenting of patches can be dangerous and energy extensive for an organism. So if you live in one of these tiny little sections and you're trying to get back to the other, it can be hard to do. So if the patches are far enough apart, a population may be divided into subpopulations. And a bunch of subpopulations that interact with limited movement between them is called a metapopulation. So they're not living together. It's actually a bigger population spread across by 3. If the populations are super isolated, then organisms might not be able to move across them. And now we've created a small isolated population, and this could be at risk of extinction. So conservation biologists are trying to study the loss, protection, and restoration of biodiversity in situations like this. Okay. We have this thing called a geographic information system, which is a use of technology to help understand ecosystems better. So what it does is it looks at a bunch of different things, a bunch of different data, and collapses them on top of each other so you can see everything in one image or one view. So we'll look at human development, so what's around. I see roads and houses. We're going to look at the flora and the fauna, meaning the plants and animal life that are there. We look at the topography, so the geographical features of the land. We'd look at the hydrology, where there's water found on the land, as well as the geology, the layers of the earth, and combine them into one image. That way we can we can understand how they all work together. So that's the geographic information system, or the GIS. And again, models help us understand systems because we can't really run experiments on them. So what we do is we make our models with all the data that we can. So we're going to test models to explain and predict ecological systems. So there's this flow here. So it's very similar to the scientific method. We make observations, design hypotheses, construct a model, and run experiments on the model. And then we're going to gather data and look at our conclusions and then refine our model. So we're constantly rebuilding the model again, just like the scientific method. And the last thing here is that these ecosystem services that we've been talking about, they sustain our world. So we cannot live without these ecosystem services. The planet can't survive and we can't. So for example, soil formation, which is how we have agriculture, water purification, how we have clean drinking water, pollination, how our plants are able to survive, breakdown of biodegradable waste, stability of negative feedback cycles. So all of these things, there's a huge big list in table 5.1 in your book, are required for us to survive, for human society to survive. And so the most important may be the cycling of the elements that we call macronutrients and micronutrients, which we're going to talk about in the next lesson. So the nutrient cycling is probably the most important of these. And that's all.